Just minutes ago, a black vehicle slipped through a private entrance far from the usual royal cameras. Prince William stepped out alone. No aides, no public engagement, no explanation. Waiting beyond the door was Catherine's father, and whatever brought these two men together was never meant to become public. In this dramatized fictional scenario, nothing about the meeting feels casual. It carries the weight of something deliberately removed from palace routine, something too personal for official corridors and too sensitive for the usual machinery surrounding the monarchy. William has not come as the future king surrounded by advisors. He has come alone, as Catherine's husband, seeking answers from the man who knew her before duty became inseparable from her name. And that distinction matters, because William and Catherine's father stand on opposite sides of an extraordinary divide. One belongs to a dynasty built around inheritance, continuity, and rules designed to survive generations. The other belongs to Catherine's private world, the family that knew her before titles, protocol, expectations, and succession entered every conversation. Catherine connects them, but tonight she is conspicuously absent. So why would William choose this meeting instead of the palace? That is where the mystery deepens. Within this fictional story, William has recently begun questioning what happens when Catherine's personal interests collide with traditions older than either of them. Royal advisors can explain precedent. They can explain protocol. They can explain what has always been done. But there are questions even the most experienced courtier cannot answer without placing the institution first. And William may no longer be willing to accept that. He arrives carrying a slim, dark portfolio. Nothing extravagant. Nothing that would immediately expose its importance. Yet whatever rests inside appears serious enough to justify a meeting without Catherine, without senior courtiers, and without any announcement explaining why the future king has suddenly sought out his father-in-law in private. That silence creates its own tension. No official engagement has been attached to the visit. No statement explains it. No familiar royal figure appears beside him. And Catherine's absence raises the most uncomfortable possibility of all. Perhaps this conversation concerns something she does not yet know William has discovered. Her father, after all, is more than a relative standing outside the royal system. In this story, he represents the life Catherine once had, the part of her identity untouched by crowns, ceremonial obligations, and expectations about what must eventually be passed from one generation to another. And that is precisely why William has come. Because shortly before this secret meeting was arranged, he allegedly received information about a single object connected intimately to Catherine's future, an object surrounded by family memory, royal expectation, and an unresolved question of ownership. The disturbing detail was simple. Whatever this object was, it officially belonged to neither Catherine nor William. And to understand why that single object could bring two normally private men behind a locked door, we have to go back to a promise supposedly made long before Catherine ever expected to stand beside a future king. Before the titles, before the balconies, and before Catherine's life became inseparable from the crown, there was allegedly a private understanding, something her family believed would remain untouched by royal protocol. Years later, that understanding may have collided with one of the monarchy's oldest and least forgiving rules. In this dramatized story, Catherine's entrance into royal life was never simply about romance. It meant stepping into an institution with centuries of expectations, inherited customs, and invisible boundaries. Her family understood that from the beginning. They knew certain freedoms would narrow, certain choices would become public, and ordinary family moments could suddenly carry constitutional weight. But they supposedly believed one thing would remain untouched. What was personal would stay personal. That belief rested on a quiet family promise. Sentimental possessions, private letters, inherited gifts, and items connected directly to Catherine were never supposed to become absorbed into royal tradition simply because her life had changed. To her family, ownership meant something straightforward. If something was given to Catherine, it was hers. If it came from family, it belonged to family memory. Inside the monarchy, however, the boundaries were far less simple. There were personal possessions. There were objects associated with royal duty. There were inherited pieces, collection items, ceremonial property, and heirlooms, whose ownership could depend as much on tradition as paperwork. And somewhere inside that maze sat the object that would eventually force William to seek answers privately. It was known, in this fictional account, as the Hartwell piece. The Hartwell piece was an old diamond and sapphire ornament with a reputation larger than its size. It had appeared in private royal portraits generations earlier, then virtually vanished from public life after a bitter family disagreement. The story surrounding it had never been fully explained, and that silence only made it more powerful. Years later, Catherine was supposedly told she would have a unique role in deciding its future. Not simply wearing it, deciding what should happen to it. That distinction would become everything, because a recently uncovered clause appeared to suggest the exact opposite. According to the new interpretation, Catherine could be connected to the Hartwell piece without having the final authority over where it eventually went. Her wishes might matter, but they might not control the outcome. And suddenly, Catherine's father was no longer a distant observer. He allegedly held something the palace did not, a handwritten letter kept outside royal archives, a letter that appeared to describe the Hartwell piece in completely different terms. Where official tradition spoke of continuity, the private letter spoke of personal intention. Then, William learned something even more unsettling. Palace preparations had supposedly already begun concerning the future of the piece, and Catherine's family had not been consulted. That was the moment the issue stopped being about diamonds and sapphires. For William, the deeper question became painfully personal. If royal tradition could reach into something Catherine believed was hers, then what? Exactly. Had she ever truly possessed beyond the institution's reach? But the moment William began asking who actually controlled the Hartwell piece, the answers stopped coming, and one particular palace official reportedly gave him a warning that transformed a family disagreement into something far more dangerous. The monarchy has survived because not every rule is written down. Some are understood, some are inherited, and some are obeyed, because nobody wants to discover what happens when they are challenged. William's questions had supposedly brought him face to face with one of those invisible boundaries. In this dramatized story, the answer William received was not a law, not a decree, and not something stamped with royal authority. It was something colder than that. An expectation, a silent understanding passed from one generation of advisors to the next. Inside the palace, these fictional continuity rules existed to ensure that objects carrying royal meaning remained connected to the institution, even when the people wearing them changed. That was the trap. Catherine could wear certain pieces. She could become closely associated with them. The public could even come to see them as hers. But association was not the same as control. And when William asked whether Catherine herself could decide where the Hartwell piece eventually went, the answer became painfully unclear. For a woman who might one day stand beside a king, the contradiction was brutal. She could represent continuity, carry expectation, and embody the future of the monarchy, yet still have less personal authority over certain symbols attached to her than an ordinary person might have over a family heirloom. That was when Catherine's father entered the story with something the palace interpretation could not easily dismiss. In this fictional account, he possessed a copy of an old private letter written by a deceased royal relative, someone who had known the Hartwell dispute long before Catherine was part of royal life. The language was careful, almost restrained, but one phrase cut through everything around it. The peace, the letter argued, should belong to the woman, not merely the office she occupies. And suddenly, the conflict had a shape. This was no longer just about ownership. It was about a woman versus an institution. About whether Catherine's identity could ever remain separate from the role she had married into. About whether personal intention could survive inside a system built to preserve continuity above almost everything else. William now faced two loyalties pulling in opposite directions. One belonged to the monarchy he was expected to inherit. The other belonged to the woman he had promised to protect. Palace advisors, in this dramatized narrative, urged caution. If one old letter could reopen the question of the Hartwell peace, what would stop similar challenges involving other royal objects? Where would personal possession end and crown stewardship begin? Catherine's father cared far less about that precedent. His concern was simpler, and therefore harder to escape. Were his daughter's wishes being respected? William understood then why a palace meeting could never give him the answer he needed. The moment courtiers entered the room, the issue would become institutional. So he went directly to Catherine's father, hoping to hear the family version before protocol shaped the story for him. Yet when William finally saw the letter for himself, one sentence reportedly stopped the conversation cold, because the document was not merely discussing a jewel. It appeared to anticipate a future crisis inside the royal family. The paper was old. The language was careful. But buried inside the fictional letter was a warning written as though its author somehow knew that one day a future Princess of Wales would be forced to choose between family wishes and royal expectation, and that her husband would be trapped between them. In this dramatized story, William and Catherine's father sat with the letter between them, neither rushing to break the silence. The document carried names William recognized from an earlier royal generation. Names tied to family history, inheritance, and decisions that had long since been buried beneath ceremony. But one sentence stood apart from the rest. The Hartwell peace, the letter warned, should never become a test of obedience for the woman entrusted with it. That phrase changed everything. It suggested this argument had happened before. According to the fictional history surrounding the jewel, a Duchess of Hartwell had once found herself in almost the same position. After being widowed, she allegedly refused to surrender the peace when senior members of the family expected it to return quietly to royal custody. What followed was not a public scandal. It was something more typical of an old institution: silence, distance, and a family rupture that gradually disappeared from official retellings. For William, the implications were disturbing. Perhaps the Hartwell peace had vanished from public life not because it had lost importance, but because it represented a conflict the monarchy had decided was safer to forget. Then, Catherine's father revealed something even more personal. Catherine had seen the letter before. Long before the current dispute, and before her royal responsibilities became even heavier, she had allegedly been shown its contents in private. She had not demanded ownership. She had not threatened confrontation. Her concern had been quieter and more complicated. What would happen decades from now? What if her children inherited the same competing loyalties? What if a future daughter or daughter-in-law found herself trapped between family intention and royal expectation? Then came the detail that made the letter impossible to dismiss. A handwritten notation at the bottom appeared to suggest that the Hartwell peace should ultimately pass to a female descendant chosen personally by the woman entrusted with it. That was far more than sentimental language. Within the fictional dispute, palace tradition assumed the jewel would remain available to future senior royal women regardless of one individual's wishes. But the notation suggested something radically different: personal choice. William understood immediately what accepting that principle could mean. It would not simply settle Catherine's position. It could change how an object expected to move through generations was understood. And Catherine's father finally asked the question that had been building beneath everything else. Did Catherine's wishes matter only when they agreed with tradition? William did not answer. That silence carried more weight than any argument. Because for the first time, the future king was being asked not what the institution expected of him, but what kind of husband he intended to be when those expectations became impossible to separate. But William's silence was not the most unsettling part of the meeting. Because according to the fictional scenario, he had brought something of his own, and when he finally opened the dark portfolio, Catherine's father understood why William had come in person. Until that moment, Catherine's father may have believed William came looking for information. Instead, the fictional prince had arrived carrying information of his own. Inventories, correspondence, and one recently amended document suggesting somebody inside the royal system had already made plans for the disputed jewel. In this dramatized story, the contents of the folder changed the balance of the meeting immediately. William was no longer simply asking what Catherine's family knew. He was bringing evidence of what the institution appeared to be preparing. The first document was an inventory extract. The second was a set of internal correspondence. The third, and most troubling, was a succession planning memorandum that referred to the Hartwell piece in language that seemed cold, formal, and already settled. None of it proved wrongdoing. That was not the point. The tension came from what the documents implied. The inventory classified the Hartwell piece in a way William believed ignored the private letter entirely. There was no mention of personal choice, no reference to the phrase about the woman, not merely the office. Instead, the wording treated the jewel as though its future connection to the royal line was already understood. Then came the memorandum. Buried inside was a reference to a future ceremonial use for the Hartwell piece, years from now, as though someone had already assumed where it would be, who would control it, and under what circumstances it might reappear. Catherine's father saw that as proof. To him, the institution had not merely been considering possibilities. It had already made a decision without Catherine. William pushed back. Royal planning, he argued, often dealt in possibilities. A memorandum could anticipate future events without settling ownership. Drafting a plan was not the same as issuing a command. For the first time, the conversation sharpened. Catherine's father asked the question William could not easily dismiss. If the plan meant nothing, then why had Catherine never been shown it? William had no immediate answer. That silence became even heavier when he revealed that the memorandum was not an old document. It had been revised recently. The dispute was no longer buried in history. It was moving. One line referred to an upcoming family settlement review. That phrase changed the urgency completely. William had apparently come before that review because he understood how quickly informal assumptions could become fixed positions once officials, advisors, and senior family members entered the same discussion. Once the machinery started moving, stopping it would become far more difficult. And Catherine's father finally understood what William was really doing. He was not investigating Catherine. He was trying to reach the truth before the institution reached a conclusion. But just as that realization seemed to bring the two men closer, another possibility surfaced, one neither of them had fully considered. Catherine herself might already know far more than they believed. Because while William and her father were discussing what Catherine should be told, one message changed the entire temperature of the room. The fictional revelation that Catherine had quietly taken action weeks earlier. For hours, the mystery seemed to revolve around two men deciding how to protect Catherine from a royal dispute. Then came the twist neither could ignore. Catherine was not waiting to be protected. In this fictional story, she had already anticipated the battle and quietly made a decision of her own. The revelation changed the meaning of everything that had come before. While William had been questioning palace assumptions, and while Catherine's father had been guarding the old letter, Catherine herself had supposedly commissioned an independent historical review of the Hartwell piece. She had done it privately, not because she wanted to deceive William, but because she feared that bringing him in too early would force him into a confrontation before the facts were clear. The review produced no easy answer. Instead, it uncovered several competing versions of the jewel's ownership. One interpretation supported royal continuity. Another gave greater weight to personal inheritance. A third suggested the piece had moved between those categories depending on who held it and why. Nothing was completely conclusive. But Catherine had not stopped at research. She had also prepared her own written statement. And that was where the real surprise began. In this dramatized account, Catherine did not demand that the Hartwell piece become hers outright. She did not insist that it pass directly to her children. She did not attempt to defeat the palace interpretation with a competing claim of ownership. Her concern was bigger than herself. She feared the jewel could become a source of bitterness between future generations, especially if different branches of the family believed they had stronger moral or symbolic claims. So Catherine proposed something neither side had expected, placing the Hartwell piece into a special family trust, separating ceremonial use from permanent personal ownership. It was a compromise, but it was not a comfortable one. Traditionalists could see it as weakening long-standing royal control. Catherine's own family could see it as surrendering the simpler principle that she should decide the jewel's fate herself. Her father was conflicted. William, however, saw something deeper. Catherine was trying to solve a battle everyone had built around her without making herself the winner. The most emotional part of her fictional proposal concerned the women who might come after her. Daughters, daughters-in-law, and others entering royal life without generations of inherited protection behind them. Catherine wanted the arrangement to make one point unmistakable, that joining the monarchy should never mean surrendering every part of personal identity to it. That realization hit William hard. He finally understood why she had not come to him first. Catherine had feared that, however much he loved her, he might instinctively see the problem through succession, continuity, and responsibility before seeing what it felt like to live inside those expectations. And that hurt. William had entered the meeting believing he was protecting Catherine. Now he was being forced to confront the possibility that even she sometimes saw him as part husband, part institution. Her father did not soften the truth. William could not be completely outside the monarchy while also being destined to lead it. And with that, the meeting stopped being an investigation into a jewel. It became a test of what William was willing to risk. And that decision carries consequences far beyond one marriage or one jewel, because challenging the expected arrangement would force William to confront the very advisors whose loyalty he will one day depend upon. Every future king inherits more than a crown. He inherits rules he did not write, loyalties he did not choose, and conflicts previous generations postponed. Now, in this dramatized scenario, William faces the most dangerous kind of royal decision, one where every available choice can be interpreted as betrayal. By this point, the Hartwell dispute has become far bigger than a duel. William now has three choices, and none of them offer a clean escape. He can support the existing palace interpretation and preserve continuity. He can endorse Catherine's trust proposal and challenge the assumptions surrounding the peace. Or he can delay everything, hoping time will create space for compromise. But delay carries its own danger. If William supports tradition, he risks confirming Catherine's deepest fear, that when private wishes collide with royal expectation, the institution will always come first. If he supports her proposal immediately, advisors may question whether the future king is allowing personal loyalty to interfere with the very system he is expected to protect. And if he waits, officials may formalize the existing plan before Catherine has any real opportunity to shape it. Catherine's father does not ask William for a grand promise. He asks something more difficult. Where does Catherine stand when duty and marriage pull in opposite directions? William's answer is careful. Protecting Catherine, he argues, cannot simply mean fighting every battle in public. If the dispute becomes a wider controversy, she could become the center of a conflict she never wanted. Her name could be dragged into arguments about inheritance, privilege, and royal power when her actual goal was to prevent exactly that kind of division. But Catherine's father pushes back. Secrecy, he argues, can protect an institution just as easily as it protects a person. And when only one side understands the rules, silence can become pressure. That is when William returns to the black folder. There is one final page inside. Unlike the inventories and internal notes, this document is his own. In this fictional account, William has drafted a written instruction requesting that no final decision involving the Hartwell piece be made without Catherine's explicit written agreement. But it has not been signed. Not yet. The page reveals something important. William did not enter this meeting neutral. He came undecided, yes, but already leaning toward intervention. Catherine's father studies the note and gives him a simple answer. Words hidden in a folder change nothing. If William believes Catherine must have a voice, then he has to make that belief real. The silence stretches. Then William signs. There is no triumph in the moment, because almost immediately another detail emerges. The royal review he believed was still weeks away is reportedly scheduled much sooner. Suddenly, the signature is no longer a precaution. It is a challenge. The meeting has not prevented the confrontation. It has accelerated it. By the time William leaves the room, the private family question has become an institutional challenge, and somewhere inside the royal machine, people are about to discover that the future king has drawn a line they never expected him to draw. When the door finally opened, William walked out looking composed. Cameras would capture only a few seconds, a vehicle, a guarded expression, another royal departure. But inside this fictional drama, the real story had already changed. A private meeting had produced a decision capable of echoing through generations. What happened inside was not a settlement. It was something far more fragile, and potentially far more important. Two men who had entered the conversation from completely different worlds had found common ground. Catherine's father came from the world of family loyalty, personal promises, and memories that existed long before titles. William came from the world of continuity, duty, and an institution built to survive individual lives. Neither had abandoned his position. But both now understood the other more clearly. Catherine's father knew William was prepared to challenge at least part of the institutional assumption surrounding the Hartwell piece. And William, in turn, finally understood that his father-in-law was not trying to interfere with the monarchy. He was trying to protect the daughter he had known before royal responsibility reached into almost every corner of her public identity. The signed instruction changed the immediate balance. In this dramatized account, no final decision concerning the Hartwell piece could now move forward without Catherine's written participation. But stopping one decision created a dozen new questions. Who had shown William the revised memorandum? Who knew Catherine's father possessed the private letter? Who inside the institution had been aware of Catherine's independent review? And perhaps most dangerously, who would decide whether William's intervention was an act of caution or a challenge to precedent? That was what advisors might fear most, not the jewel itself, precedent. Because if Catherine could redefine the stewardship of one object deeply associated with royal tradition, future spouses might ask similar questions. What belongs to the role? What belongs to the person? And who gets to decide when those two identities can no longer be separated? That is where the real power of this fictional story lies. Royal authority does not always arrive through dramatic commands. Sometimes it exists through assumptions repeated for so long that nobody remembers when they became rules. William's choice, then, is not simply heroic. It is painful. To protect Catherine fully, he may eventually have to question parts of the very institution he is expected to preserve. And Catherine remains the greatest mystery of all. Her private review suggests she may have anticipated the resistance. Her proposal suggests she understood the family argument before either man entered that room. Which leaves one final possibility hanging over everything. Perhaps Catherine never intended to avoid this confrontation. Perhaps she intended to force it. Did she expect William to discover the letter? Was the trust proposal designed to expose the weakness in the old arrangement? And if she has questioned this tradition, what others has she quietly reconsidered? The Hartwell piece itself remains unseen, yet it has already revealed the real conflict. This was never simply about who owns a jewel. It was about whether someone entering one of the world's oldest institutions can reshape what that institution believes it has the right to control. And if Catherine's private proposal reaches the wider royal circle, the next meeting may not take place behind one discreet door. It could force every branch of the fictional royal household to answer the question William has finally put in writing. When tradition and family collide, who gets the final word?